So a lot of you guys and girls who have followed my channel probably know about the various reviews I have done for River's works. From Death to the Soul, to Cora, to Midnight Kiss, to Quinn, to Archie, and you've also probably seen my unofficial narration of their short story of Grimm. However, we shall not be talking about Dead Souls for this video. Instead, this review is going to be a very special one indeed. For today, I will be covering the very first book that River ever wrote. And honestly, guys, I'm very excited to talk about this one. Because in all honesty, despite the circumstances that River went through while writing this one, this, hands down, proves to me that even back then, River had amazing talent as a story writer. Today, I will be talking about the spiritual fantasy known as the Rise of Erenthia. So to start off with the question of why I call this story a spiritual fantasy. Well, from what River told me, this was made back when they were a Christian, so there are very heavily Christian influences littered throughout the book. However, the story itself is very fascinating. It's very well written. So our story in Rise of Erenthia follows the story of a young woman known as Anessa, and her growing up in her small village, surrounded by people who all believe in the Creator. Hell, they even have something called the Life of Text. And honestly, if that doesn't tell you already that this is very heavily Christian based, I don't know what will. So Anessa grows up with her grandmother and her best friend known as Aaron. And throughout it all, we see that Anessa herself is coping with a massive amount of loss, as well as not only that, but spiritual struggles. Because Anessa finds it harder and harder to believe in the Creator throughout the story, and not exactly for the wrong reasons. For you see, a while back, Anessa not only lost her grandmother, but her best friend Aaron. Her grandmother died of natural causes, but her best friend Aaron, the one who really understood her, was killed during a sickness. Because of this, Anessa has essentially lived her life as essentially the outcast of her village. No one really connects with her, and the only person who even bothers to talk to her is the son of the chief and future leader of the village, Kobar. And even he himself keeps his distance from her, because back then, Kobar and Aaron were apparently lovers, and Anessa was only known by Kobar through association by Aaron. However, we can definitely dive into Anessa's complex state of mind. We see for a fact that she is struggling still with the loss of Aaron, as well as her struggles with faith in the Creator, feeling like she cannot feel the great Creator. She doesn't feel it. No matter how hard she tries, she just cannot feel it. Everyone else in her village essentially isolates and practically persecutes her for her questions. They keep on telling her, hey, don't be sad about it, just get over it, or pray to the great Creator. They'll solve it, he'll solve it. And Anessa's frustrated with this. No matter what she tries, she cannot feel that presence. Until at one point, it all blows over when one day Anessa suddenly finds herself enshrouded by shadows that seem to follow her, and are in fact tied to her emotions. However, due to an accident where she accidentally wounds the lover of Kobar, known as Lauren, who really was not helping the situation at all, essentially being a snotty brat to Anessa during a very vulnerable moment for her. Essentially because of this, Anessa is banned from her village for a simple accident. Because of this, she is banished to the Outlands and expected to die. But I can tell you right now, Anessa is definitely a complicated character. You can actually feel the frustration when she wakes up in the Outlands, literally in a barren wasteland, and all she has next to her is her life in text. That is literally like her village smacking her in the face, saying, hey, we're going to leave you to die. Maybe you can repent before you do. Which to me, that's just a harsh slap in the face. Like, come on. So Anessa runs into a young man known as Braylon, And we also see how not only that is she introduced to Braylon, but she's also introduced to Twyla, who in this story is actually seen as the daughter of the Creator. Someone who is essentially taking all the pain and evil that humanity commits upon themselves due to the great love that the Creator and Twyla have for humanity. It's to the point that Twyla has literally been reduced to nothing more than a brain in a frozen forest on top of a tree. Which to me is just absolutely a mind-boggling image to put to mind. But throughout it all, we also find out that Braylon himself has a unique power. He doesn't have the ability to cast solid shadows like Anessa does, but he can in fact change his appearance into that of a beast. He's a skin changer. Which to me, those are actually some pretty cool powers, not gonna lie. But throughout it all, we see Anessa learning to control her powers and learning how to create constructs from chairs to weapons and even buildings, like full-fledged solid houses out of solid shadows, which when struck by starlight looks like it is shining in the stars, to the point that Anessa actually calls it Starstone. Which to me seems like it's pretty fitting. I mean, if you have something that's essentially going to sparkle like a diamond, or like the starry night sky, Starstone pretty much works. But we see not only this, but we see Anessa learning how to control her powers, and after receiving help from others, she finds out about the plight of the skin changers, how they are kept in cages in the middle of other villages, where they're treated not just as outcasts, but as entertainment. They are seen as sinners by the other people, or even just abominations, freaks of nature. So Anessa goes out of her way to gather an army to free the skin changers and start a new kingdom in the Outlands, which she calls, in honor of her best friend, Erenthia. And we actually see how she creates a massive community of not just shadow manipulators, or sombra-pastores, but also skin changers. She brings them all together, all the outcasts of humanity, brings them together and establishes a thriving community. We even see how she grows her kingdom from not only just a small city. She builds a full-fledged palace. She finds a mine and starts digging up precious ore. We even see her starting up a fishing town right by the sea. We see her encountering other characters. Not just Braylon, but we also see her encountering others such as Alcott, another older man who essentially becomes an advisor and a dear friend to Eren, despite his ailing age. And there are many other characters that are introduced as well throughout the story. But this story is not without a dark turn, which really adds a huge climax to the story. And I'm not kidding you guys when I say I finished this book in like 3 days because I could not put it down. So, a small spoiler here, but Alcott, unfortunately, due to his advanced age, he winds up dying. And Anessa's grief, like the stages of grief that she goes through after witnessing a dear friend of hers die again. Like, keep in mind, she's already lost her grandmother, she has lost her best friend Eren, she's been kicked out of her village, but she hasn't really had time to grieve, to really process this. And Alcott's death is really just the tipping edge for where we see her take a dark turn. Instead of seeming like a good queen, she goes out of her way to not only overly tax her citizens, but raise up an army to attack the other villages and free the other skin changers by force. We see her just devolving into and keeping everybody else away, even her adopted daughter Olivia, and even Braylon. She strikes out at everyone who tries to get close to her, and continues lying through her teeth saying that she's fine. Meanwhile, we see her spiraling further and further into grief and anger. And at one point, she even looks for revenge against Lauren and Kovar. Like, she actually sneaks into her old village and learns what Kovar and Lauren really thought of her. That everyone essentially found her draining. Like, Kovar essentially kept saying, I tried, but she was just a handful. And her friend and lover Braylon at this time hears all of this and literally snaps at these two, saying, did you even try to listen to her instead of talking over her? Which to me makes a lot of sense. Like if someone has questions, sometimes the best thing to do is just shut up and listen. But Anessa, hearing this, goes on the warpath. She completely decimates her old village and takes Kovar and Lauren prisoner. And at one point, she actually plans to execute them via feeding them to the wolves. And at that point, she realizes that she has crossed a major line, to the point that she even contemplates suicide. But throughout all of this, she's eventually saved and realized that there are still people who care about her. And gradually, we see her coming to restore her faith and learning a different way. For her grandmother actually came up with an interesting proposition, that the Creator is not strictly male, that they can be whoever the person needs them to be, whether it be a father or mother figure. And to me, that's honestly a pretty genius way of looking at it. Because sometimes you can't really put a pin on a creator. You can't really identify them as a singular gender. For if I may pull from the Bible here, God created both man and woman. So you can't really put a full-fledged gender on God. God is just that, the Creator. They are God. But anyways, small bit over. So we see Anessa struggling to overcome her grief with the aid of Olivia, Braylon, and all the others as they try to help her to overcome her grief and her rage and her anger. And honestly, the way it ends is very, very wholesome. We see years down the road that Anessa has grown old. She's had children with Braylon, whom she winds up marrying and having children with. And we see her on her deathbed telling her children, hey, you've got this. I know you'll do well when I'm gone. And it ends with a very wholesome moment where Anessa is united with all of her loved ones, Braylon, Aaron, and even Alcott and her grandmother. All of them are reunited in eternity. And I gotta admit, that was a very wholesome ending, if I may. So, you've heard me talk about this long enough. Let's go ahead and talk about some of the more fascinating pieces that I loved about this book, besides the story. So one of the first of the unique factors that I liked about Rise of Erenthia was the two mystical creatures that we had there, the Sombran Pastoris and the Skin Changers. Now, to first talk about the Shadow Users, I really liked how they just seemed totally broken when it comes to power scaling. Like, these guys can literally mold into shadows or just create solid constructs, and the only limit is their imagination. They can literally conjure a shovel or a blade or even a full-fledged building or a house, and all it requires is just their imagination. But something I definitely liked about the Sombran Pastoris is the fact that the shadows seem to be linked to a person's negative emotions, or just emotions in general. Like, the higher an emotion, the more you focus it, the more it just seems to pulse. Like, to give an example, one point when Anessa is grieving, the shadows literally explode out of her. Or when she seems to be devolving into grief, they seem to like swirl around her like a fierce gale or a storm. And I gotta tell you guys, when I first thought about the constructs, and this cannot leave my brain now that I think about it, is that it actually reminds me a lot of the Green Lanterns from DC Comics, who also have a similar ability, where they create constructs with their mind, but fueled not just by emotion, but by the emotion of willpower. Which is funny, considering that literally there are other Lantern Corps throughout DC Comics who all use various emotions to create constructs. All in all, just a funny little similarity I noticed. Now, as for the Skin Changers, what I really like about them is that it's not just humans pressing their minds into another animal, like, say, in Game of Thrones, where Brandon Stark seems to cast his mind out to other animals or even humans. But it is, in fact, a physical change. Like, based on what the person wants, they can change into that animal, ranging from either a small mouse or a rat, all the way to a massive grizzly bear. Which to me, that just spells terrifying with a capital T. Let's just imagine you're talking to a normal guy, you really tick him off, and the next thing you know, you're facing a 200-pound grizzly bear that is snarling at you. That is just awesome. But definitely one of the biggest things that I liked about Rise of Erenthia were the themes that were presented here, such as coping with loss and grief, depression, struggles with faith, and learning to love oneself. Throughout this book, it's all from Anessa's perspective. We see her coping with loss and grief, but in a very bad way, that to the point that it leads to depression. She has lost the two people that really understood her grandmother and her best friend Aaron. Everyone else essentially treats her like an outcast in her old village, and we see that because of this, she can't cope as well with the loss of her best friend. She still finds herself struggling with her faith when it comes to the great creator. Everyone in her village casts them as he, thinking that if you just pray hard enough, he will listen. But Anessa struggles with this, saying that she cannot feel the creator, which leads into these struggles with faith theme. But more importantly, it's learning to love oneself that is presented very loudly throughout this book. Throughout it all, we see that Anessa cannot love herself. Like, she feels like she is unworthy. She feels unclean. She feels like she just doesn't belong. She feels like everywhere she goes, she just causes more people pain. She hates herself. But throughout it all, we see Braylon trying to help her and teaching her to say a phrase every day to improve her image of herself. And honestly, you guys, some of these themes are very impactful to a lot of us for today. Some of us do cope with loss or grief. Some of us are struggling with depression, or even just believing in something, or learning to love ourselves. These are themes that struck very highly a chord with me. And I'm sure they might strike a chord with all of you as well, for those of you who struggle with the same things that are presented in this book. And I will tell you guys right now, the sheer amount of emotion that is presented in this book is so raw that you can just feel it and empathize with the characters here. This is all from Anessa's perspective, and quite frankly, you just cannot help but feel bad for this young woman all the way through. So just coping that with the amazing story, the sheer emotion behind it is a big driving force for why I loved it so much. So after all I've said, I would give Rise of Erenthia a solid 10 out of 10. I highly recommend it if you want a good spiritual fantasy, or if you just want a unique fantasy with amazing characters, a well-written story, and something that can just be done in like a one-off novel. Like, you read it, and then it's done. There's no sequels to it, it's just a stand-out, well-done novel. Anyways, you guys, thank you so much for, again, listening to this crazy man's ramblings, and I hope to see you all again in the next video. Thank you all again for tuning in. This is the Rambling Collector, signing off. Have an awesome day.